The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains of the cozy suburban home, painting soft golden streaks across the wooden floor. 11-year-old Jamie sat at the kitchen table, his legs swinging absent-mindedly as he scribbled furiously in his notebook. His mother, Sarah, bustled around the kitchen, flipping pancakes while humming a tune from the radio. Life was simple and ordinary, at least that's how it seemed. "Mom," Jamie said suddenly, looking up from his paper. His voice carried a seriousness unusual for a boy his age. Sarah glanced at him, sensing he had something important to say. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked, flipping another pancake onto a plate. Jamie hesitated, chewing on the end of his pencil. I think I have an identical twin." Sarah froze mid-motion, the spatula hovering in the air. She turned slowly to face her son, an amused smile tugging at her lips. "An identical twin," she repeated, her tone light but curious. "Where's this coming from?" Jamie shrugged, looking down at his notebook. "I don't know. I just feel it, like someone out there is exactly like me." Sarah let out a soft laugh and ruffled his messy brown hair. "That's quite the imagination you've got there, Jamie. Maybe you've been watching too many movies." But Jamie wasn't laughing. His hazel eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her pause. "I'm serious, Mom. I can feel it. I dream about him sometimes. He looks just like me, but he's different. And it's not like the dreams you forget when you wake up. These feel real." For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the soft sizzle of the frying pan. Sarah's mind raced. Jamie had always been a creative kid, prone to wild stories and vivid dreams, but this was different. His conviction was unsettling. "Okay," Sarah said gently, trying to brush off the eerie feeling creeping into her chest. "How about we talk more about this after breakfast? Your pancakes are getting cold." Jamie nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. He quietly ate his breakfast, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Sarah tried to shake off the conversation, chalking it up to childhood imagination. But the idea lingered in her mind long after Jamie had left for school. That evening, as Jamie sat on the living room floor building a spaceship out of Lego blocks, Sarah decided to probe further. "Jamie," she began, sitting down on the couch with a cup of tea. "Tell me more about this twin of yours. Why do you think he exists?" Jamie's eyes lit up. He abandoned his Lego project and turned to face her. "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I'm connected to someone. Like, when I'm sad, I think he feels sad too. And sometimes I dream about places I've never been, but they feel familiar, like they're his memories." Sarah frowned, a chill running down her spine. It wasn't unusual for kids to have imaginary friends or create stories, but this felt different. It felt real. "Have you ever told anyone else about this?" she asked carefully. Jamie shook his head. "No, I thought people would think I was weird." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're not weird, Jamie, but this is something we need to look into." The following days were a whirlwind. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there might be some truth to Jamie's claims. She found herself diving into old photo albums, searching for answers she wasn't even sure existed. Jamie's father had left before he was born, and Sarah realized she didn't know much about his family history. Could there have been another child? A twin? One afternoon, Sarah made a decision. She sat Jamie down at the kitchen table, her expression serious but reassuring. "Jamie, I think it's time we take a DNA test, just to see if there's any truth to this." Jamie's face lit up with hope. "You believe me?" "I believe that you believe it," Sarah said carefully. "And if there's even a chance you're right, I want to find out." The DNA test kit arrived a few days later. Sarah explained the process to Jamie, and together they swabbed their cheeks and sealed the samples in the provided envelopes. As they dropped the package into the mailbox, Jamie looked up at his mom. "What if it comes back, and I really do have a twin?" Sarah smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "Then we'll deal with it together." The weeks that followed were agonizing. Every day, Jamie asked if the results had arrived, and every day, Sarah had to tell him to wait a little longer. She tried to keep herself busy, but the anticipation gnawed at her. What if Jamie was right? What if there was another child out there, a child she had never known about? Finally, the email came. Sarah's heart raced as she opened the message, her hands trembling. The results were detailed, full of scientific jargon she didn't fully understand. But one line stood out, clear and unmistakable. "Close familial match detected. Identical twin sibling." Sarah stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Tears welled up in her eyes as a wave of emotions crashed over her. Shock, disbelief, guilt, and a strange sense of relief. Jamie had been right all along. He wasn't just imagining things. He wasn't making it up. But how? Why had she never known? Who had kept this secret from her, and why? She closed the laptop and walked to the living room, where Jamie was sprawled on the floor, sketching in his notebook. He looked up as she entered, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Mom," he asked her softly, "did the results come back?" Sarah nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Jamie, you were right." Jamie's face broke into a grin, but Sarah's tears told him there was more to the story. "What's wrong?" he asked, his excitement fading. Sarah knelt down beside him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I don't know how this happened," she said, her voice shaking. "But we're going to find out. Together." As Jamie clung to her, a million questions swirled in Sarah's mind. Who was Jamie's twin? Where was he now? And what kind of life had he been living all this time? The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, all Sarah could do was hold her son and promise herself that she would do whatever it took to reunite him with the brother he had never known. The living room felt unusually quiet as Sarah sat with Jamie, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to answer. Jamie, on the other hand, seemed calm, almost as if he had been expecting this all along. He leaned his head against her shoulder, drawing little circles on the fabric of her sleeve with his finger. "Where do we start, Mom?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the silence. Sarah hesitated, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. I don't know yet," she admitted, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle over her. "I need to think, but I promise, we'll figure this out." Jamie nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. He trusted her completely, and Sarah felt the immense responsibility of that trust sitting heavily in her chest. That night, long after Jamie had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, scrolling through old emails and hospital records. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something, some detail that might explain how an identical twin could exist without her knowing. Memories of Jamie's birth felt distant now, but she was sure there hadn't been any complications or surprises. She had been awake during the entire delivery. Still, the DNA test didn't lie. Sarah dug deeper, her eyes growing heavy as she sifted through digital files and paperwork. Birth certificates, hospital bills, photos from the day Jamie was born. Everything seemed normal, until she found an old medical form she barely remembered signing. A gaze lingered on the hospital's logo at the top, and she frowned. This wasn't the hospital where she had given birth. Confused, she scanned the rest of the form, but the details were sparse, with only a date and a signature. Her signature. A chill ran down her spine. How could she have signed something she didn't remember? The next morning, Sarah dropped Jamie off at school but couldn't shake the lingering unease. Instead of heading home, she took a detour to the hospital where Jamie had been born. The receptionist was polite but firm. Hospital records from over a decade ago weren't easily accessible. Still, Sarah persisted, her voice trembling with urgency. "I just need to know if there were any unusual notes or records from the day my son was born," she pleaded. After what felt like hours of waiting, a nurse appeared with a small warm folder in her hands. "This is all we have," she said, sliding it across the counter. "It's not much." Sarah opened the folder with trembling fingers. Most of the contents were familiar. Her medical history, Jamie's APGAR scores, but one slip of paper caught her eye. It was a simple handwritten note. Transferred, neonatal unit, secondary location. Her heart pounded as she reread the note. Transferred, but Jamie had never left her side. Sarah's thoughts raced on the drive home. The hospital had been vague about the secondary location, offering no details except that it was routine practice for certain cases. Yet nothing about Jamie's birth had seemed unusual. Why would he have been transferred? And more importantly, could that have been the moment when something else happened? Something she hadn't been told. That evening, Jamie sat at the dining table, quietly working on his homework as Sarah prepared dinner. She glanced at him often, the weight of the new discovery pressing down on her shoulders. "Jamie," she said finally, breaking the silence, "do you remember anything from your dreams about the twin? Anything that felt different?" Jamie looked up thoughtfully, chewing the end of his pencil. "Sometimes he's in places I've never been," he said slowly. "Big buildings with lots of glass. And there's always this sound, like machines humming." Sarah's grip tightened on the edge of the counter. A hospital. Could that be what Jamie was describing? And the twin. Does he ever talk to you? She pressed gently. Jamie nodded. Not with words, but I can feel what he's thinking. It's like he's waiting for something. Or someone. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. Later that night, after Jamie had gone to sleep, Sarah found herself unable to rest. She returned to her laptop, diving down internet rabbit holes she hadn't even known existed. She searched for records of twin births, medical anomalies, and cases of separated siblings. The deeper she looked, the stranger the stories became. Stories of mistaken identities, hidden adoptions, and even covert medical trials. But none of them felt quite right. At nearly 2 in the morning, Sarah stumbled upon a small online forum dedicated to unusual birth records. Most of the posts seemed speculative, but one caught her attention. A woman had written about giving birth to twins, only to be told that one of them had been stillborn. Except years later, she found out that the second child had survived and been placed for adoption without her knowledge. Sarah's breath caught. Could something like that have happened to her? The thought felt absurd, impossible even, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. She bookmarked the page, her mind swirling with questions. Days passed, and Sarah found herself more distracted than ever. Jamie noticed, of course. He always did. "Is everything okay, Mom?" he asked one afternoon as they drove home from school. Sarah forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "Yeah, honey, I'm just thinking a lot. Nothing for you to worry about." But Jamie didn't look convinced. That weekend, Sarah made a decision. She sat Jamie down at the table, holding both his hands in hers. "Jamie, I need to ask you something very important," she said gently. Jamie nodded, his eyes wide with curiosity. "If there was a chance we could find your twin, if he's really out there, would you want to meet him?" Jamie's face lit up with excitement. "Yes, can we?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted, "but I'm going to try." Jamie threw his arms around her, and Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. The pieces were beginning to come together, and with every step, the mystery of Jamie's twin felt closer to being unraveled. Sarah spent the next few days making phone calls, sending emails, and digging through every contact she could think of. Each time she explained her situation, the reaction was the same: a polite, sympathetic response followed by a dead end. The hospital records were vague, and the transfer note led nowhere. It felt like every path she took brought her back to square one. But Sarah wasn't the type to give up easily, especially when it came to Jamie. One afternoon, while sorting through some of Jamie's old baby clothes she had stored away, Sarah found herself holding a tiny knitted cap. It was pale blue, the kind hospitals usually give to newborns. She remembered Jamie wearing it in his first days home. But as she turned it over in her hands, something strange caught her eye. Inside the brim, faintly stitched in thread, were initials, Jail. Sarah frowned. Jamie's full name was Jamie Carter. The initials didn't match. She felt her heartbeat quicken as a thought crept into her mind. Could it have belonged to the twin? Had she unknowingly kept something from him all this time? That night, Sarah sat by Jamie's bed after he had fallen asleep, gently brushing a hand through his hair. His breathing was soft and steady, but even in rest, there was something in his expression that felt distant. She wondered if he could sense the weight she carried. The next day, Sarah visited a friend who worked as a pediatric nurse. She brought the cap with her, explaining the strange initials and the circumstances surrounding Jamie's birth. Her friend listened carefully, turning the cap over in her hands, before glancing up with hesitation. "You know," her friend said softly, "I've heard stories about mix-ups. Sometimes hospitals make mistakes with records or clothing, especially if there were multiple births that day. But something about this feels off." Sarah nodded, feeling that exact same unease deep in her gut. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, Jamie sat on the floor nearby playing with his dog Toby. She watched him, a tangle of emotions swirling beneath the surface. How was it possible for him to feel such a connection to someone he had never met? "Mom," Jamie suddenly said, looking up from his game, "I had the dream again last night." Sarah set down the spoon she had been stirring with and walked over, kneeling beside him. "Tell me about it," she said softly. Jamie's brow furrowed as he recalled the details. "I was standing outside a glass building, but this time I wasn't alone. He was there too. We looked the same but different, like we were the same person, but I knew he wasn't me." Jamie's voice trailed off for a moment before he added, "And then he smiled at me, but he didn't say anything. It felt like he wanted me to follow him, but I woke up." Sarah's heart twisted. Over the next few days, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something right in front of her. The dreams, the initials, the strange gaps in hospital records, it all felt connected. One evening, while Jamie was at a friend's house, Sarah found herself standing in his room, scanning the space for anything that might spark a realization. Her eyes landed on the bookshelf by his bed, lined with old photo albums and keepsakes. She pulled out one of the albums, flipping through page after page of baby pictures. Each one felt familiar until she reached the back of the album, where a handful of loose photos had been tucked away. One of them was a blurry shot from the hospital, taken shortly after Jamie's birth. In the corner of the image, just behind Sarah holding Jamie, there was a faint reflection in the glass of the hospital room window. 2 bassinets. Sarah's breath caught. She stared at the photo, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted. There was no mistaking it. One bassinet held Jamie, but the other was empty. She couldn't sleep that night, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, replaying the image in her mind. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that someone knew the truth, someone who hadn't told her everything. The next morning, Sarah packed a small bag and drove to the hospital, determined not to leave without answers. She met with a different administrator this time, explaining her situation once again. The woman behind the desk gave her the same rehearsed response about limited access to old records, but Sarah wasn't having it. "I'm not asking for much," Sarah said firmly. "I just need to know if anyone remembers anything unusual about the day my son was born. Please." The woman hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "There is one person," she said quietly. "Dr. Mitchell. He was part of the neonatal team back then. But I have to warn you, he retired a few years ago. He doesn't come in often. Can you tell me how to reach him?" The woman scribbled a phone number on a slip of paper, sliding it across the desk. Sarah wasted no time. That afternoon she dialed the number, her heart racing as it rang. A voice on the other end answered, gruff and unfamiliar. "Dr. Mitchell?" Sarah asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Sarah Carter. I believe you were involved with my son's birth about 10 years ago. Jamie Carter. I need to ask you about something I found in the records." There was a long pause on the other end. When Dr. Mitchell finally spoke, his voice had softened. "I remember you," he said quietly. Sarah's breath hitched. "I'm not sure how much I can say," he added after a moment. "But if you're asking these questions, you already know something, don't you?" Sarah swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think Jamie has a twin." There was silence, and for a moment Sarah thought he might hang up. But then Dr. Mitchell sighed deeply. "Meet me tomorrow," he said. "There are things I can't explain over the phone." As Sarah ended the call, her hands trembled. She glanced down the hallway where Jamie's bedroom door stood slightly ajar. The mystery that had been lurking in the shadows for so long was beginning to unravel, but she had no idea what kind of truth she was about to uncover.